The hidden cost of perfect prediction. It started with a forecast so accurate it felt unsettling. Not close, not approximate, exact. The future arrived exactly as the model said it would. At first, the reaction was disbelief rather than celebration. Accuracy at that level did not feel reassuring. It felt intrusive, almost unnatural. Prediction had always carried an implicit margin of error, a buffer that preserved surprise and human adjustment. This forecast left no such space. It arrived fully formed, precise down to details that once would have been dismissed as unknowable. And when reality followed it step by step, something subtle shifted. To understand why this matters now, we need to look at how prediction once worked. Forecasts were tools for navigation, not maps of destiny. Models suggested possibilities rather than outcomes. They guided preparation but left room for improvisation. Surprise was not a flaw in the system. It was an expectation. Error created feedback. Feedback created learning. Adjustment was built into every plan. That balance began to erode as data expanded and computation accelerated. Systems absorbed histories, behaviors, preferences, and signals at unprecedented scale. Patterns sharpened as noise was filtered out. Relationships that once appeared loose became tight correlations. Uncertainty collapsed under layers of refinement. Predictions stopped behaving like estimates and started behaving like schedules. At first, this felt like progress. Markets stabilized as volatility was anticipated earlier. Logistics smoothed as demand aligned with forecasts. Risks were identified sooner, mitigated before they escalated. Planning replaced reaction. The future no longer felt chaotic. It felt manageable, almost domesticated. But something else was happening beneath the surface. As predictions grew more reliable, behavior began conforming to them. People adjusted decisions not in response to unfolding reality, but in anticipation of what the models said would happen. Expectations hardened. Plans narrowed. Choices clustered around predicted outcomes, not because alternatives were impossible, but because they felt improbable. This feedback loop tightened quietly. Accurate predictions reduced deviation. Reduced deviation increased accuracy. The model learned faster because reality aligned with it more closely. Over time, the future stopped behaving like an open field and began behaving like a closed system. Prediction no longer described what might happen. It participated in making it happen. The hidden cost was not control. It was compression. Possibility shrank as variance disappeared. Alternatives faded from consideration. Surprise, once a source of insight, was reclassified as error. Deviations were treated as noise to be eliminated rather than signals to explore. The range of acceptable futures narrowed without anyone explicitly deciding that it should. Perfect prediction did not eliminate uncertainty. It relocated it. Instead of uncertainty living in outcomes, it moved into agency itself. The question was no longer what would happen, but whether individual action still mattered once the outcome was known in advance. As prediction hardened into expectation, systems adapted around it. Organizations planned exclusively for forecasted scenarios and ignored low-probability paths. Resources flowed toward what was predicted to succeed. Contingencies were trimmed away because they looked inefficient. The future was optimized early, leaving little room for deviation later. Individuals adjusted too. Career paths aligned with predicted strengths. Decisions were filtered through likelihood metrics. Risk began to feel irresponsible when forecasts suggested low odds. Acting against prediction felt less like courage and more like denial. The conflict emerged when predictions started shaping values. What was likely became what was pursued. What was unlikely became what was neglected. Innovation slowed as exploration gave way to optimization. Why experiment when outcomes were already ranked? This effect was subtle but pervasive. Education systems guided students toward statistically favorable paths. Finance allocated capital to expected winners, starving unconventional ideas of support. Medicine tailored interventions to typical outcomes, leaving edge cases underserved. Outliers lost attention not because they lacked value, but because they complicated the model. Researchers began noticing a troubling pattern. The better predictions became, the less new information mattered. Incoming data reinforced existing structures rather than challenging them. Models grew confident but stagnant. Confirmation replaced discovery. Learning plateaued, not because the system was complete, but because it no longer tolerated surprise. Attempts to correct this paradox often backfired. Introducing randomness reduced accuracy, but undermined trust in the system. Ignoring predictions invited risks that institutions were unwilling to justify. Perfect foresight had become a comfort, and comfort is difficult to abandon even when it carries long-term cost. The emotional tension peaked when a deeper realization surfaced. A perfectly predicted future is not chosen. It is accepted. Agency erodes not through coercion, but through certainty. When outcomes feel predetermined, effort loses its sense of influence. Responsibility becomes abstract. Success feels inevitable rather than earned. Failure feels preordained rather than instructive. This reframed the idea of freedom itself. Freedom was no longer about removing constraints. It was about preserving meaningful alternatives. Prediction had narrowed those alternatives quietly, without announcing that anything had been taken away. The question was no longer whether predictions were correct. It was whether correctness was worth the cost. The conflict intensified as perfect prediction began erasing accountability. If outcomes were known in advance, responsibility blurred. Decisions were justified by forecasts rather than judgment. Leaders followed models to avoid blame when results disappointed. Fault shifted to prediction instead of the choice to follow it. In organizations, strategy became compliance with probability. Deviating from a model required justification stronger than success itself. In personal lives, ambition narrowed. People avoided paths labeled unlikely, even if those paths aligned with values or curiosity. Risk became something to minimize rather than explore. This created a quiet paralysis. The clearer the future appeared, the harder it became to change. Predictions did not force behavior, but they framed it so tightly that deviation felt irrational. Choice still existed in theory, but not in practice. Researchers eventually identified the mechanism behind this effect. Prediction compresses uncertainty, but uncertainty is where learning lives. When futures are decided too early, feedback arrives too late to matter. Exploration dies not with resistance, but with irrelevance. The emotional peak arrived with a realization that cut deeply. Perfect prediction does not remove risk. It removes hope. When outcomes feel fixed, effort loses meaning. Struggle feels ceremonial. Progress becomes maintenance rather than discovery. The system had not stolen freedom. It had convinced people they no longer needed to use it, and that belief proved more powerful than any external constraint. The resolution did not come from rejecting prediction, but from reframing it. Uncertainty was deliberately reintroduced, not as ignorance, but as humility. Prediction returned to its role as guidance rather than destiny. Researchers limited forecast horizons. Models were designed to preserve ambiguity instead of erasing it. Scenarios replaced single outcomes. Decision-making valued flexibility over optimization. Systems were built to adapt rather than converge prematurely. This restored something essential. The future regained openness. Predictions informed action without dictating it. Uncertainty became space for agency rather than a flaw to eliminate. The deeper lesson was cultural. Humanity had mistaken foresight for control. Knowing what is likely does not absolve us from choosing what is meaningful. Perfect prediction is seductive because it feels safe. But safety without choice becomes stagnation. Progress depends on a willingness to step beyond expectation, even when the odds are known. The hidden cost of perfect prediction was not loss of accuracy. It was loss of possibility. And possibility is where meaning, creativity, responsibility, and change begin. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.